The hoofbeats reached Leon's O before the rider did, a slow, deliberate rhythm crossing the dry creek bed at the edge of her land, and she set down the hoe between two rows of dying corn and picked up the rifle leaning against the fence post instead. The summer heat in the Wyoming Territory had not broken in 11 days. The corn knew it. She knew it. And now a stranger on a dark brown horse was riding straight toward her house as if he had been invited. She was 27 years old, a widow for the better part of a year, and she had learned in that year that a woman alone on 60 acres could not afford to lower a rifle just because a man smiled when he reached the yard. The rider stopped a respectful distance from the porch, close enough to speak, far enough that she would have time to raise the weapon if she needed to. "Afternoon, ma'am," he said, touching the brim of his hat. "Name's Silas Bennett. I heard in town you might be needing a hand on this place." "You heard wrong," Leon said. "I am not hiring." "Heard the Whitcomb boy tell it different at the feed store," Silas said, unbothered. "Said your husband passed last autumn, and you've been running 60 acres alone since. Man'd have to be a fool not to think you could use an extra pair of hands, especially with this drought sitting on the corn the way it is." She studied him the way she studied everything now, without hurry, without sentiment. He was maybe 30, sun-weathered, his shirt gone soft and pale at the shoulders from years of the same sun that was currently killing her crop. His horse stood patient beneath him, its coat the deep brown of river mud, and something about the way the animal held itself, calm but alert, told her the man had a way with creatures that could not be faked. "Before I ever considered hiring a cowboy," she said, "I asked God for a husband. He has not sent me one yet. I doubt he sent me a ranch hand instead." Silas laughed, short and genuine, and swung down from the horse before she had given him permission to. "Well, I can't speak for what the Almighty's got planned, ma'am. I can tell you I've worked cattle and corn both since I was 14, and I can tell you your fence line's down in 2 places on the east side, which means whatever stock you've got left is one bad night from wandering clean off your property." Leon's jaw tightened, because he was right, and she hated that a stranger had noticed her failing fence before she had found time to mend it herself. "I cannot pay you." "Didn't ask you to," Silas said. "I'll work for a bed in your barn and 2 meals a day until the fence is fixed and the corn's brought in, whatever's left of it. After that, we'll talk about whether there's more work worth doing." She should have sent him away. Every instinct honed by a year of solitude told her that a strange man with a horse and no visible history was exactly the kind of trouble a widow alone could not afford. But the fence was down, and the corn was dying, and pride did not fill a root cellar for winter. She lowered the rifle, though she did not put it away entirely. "The barn," she said, "not the house. And you will eat what I eat, which is not much this summer." "Suits me fine," Silas said, and led his horse toward the barn as though the matter had never truly been in doubt. What she did not tell him, standing on that porch in the merciless afternoon heat, was that the fence had gone down 2 weeks earlier, during a storm that had also taken half her seed corn, and that the bank note her husband had signed before his death would come due at the end of summer, whether the harvest survived the drought or not. She had told no one in town the full amount of what she owed. She intended to keep it that way, even from a cowboy who noticed too much for a man who claimed to be passing through. That first night she watched him from the kitchen window as he settled his horse in the barn, unpacking a bedroll and a single canvas satchel that seemed to hold everything he owned in the world. It struck her, watching the economy of his movements, that a man who traveled that light had either lost everything once already or had never allowed himself to gather much in the first place. She did not know which, and she told herself it was not her business to wonder. She slept with the rifle beside her bed that night, as she had every night since her husband died. But she noticed, somewhere near midnight, that she had stopped listening for the particular creak of the barn door the way she usually did, half expecting trouble to announce itself. The barn was quiet. The horse was quiet. She fell asleep before she meant to, and woke at dawn to the sound of an axe splitting wood that she had not asked anyone to split. Silas Bennett proved within the first week to be exactly as capable as he had promised, and considerably more curious than she wanted him to be. He mended the east fence in a single afternoon, hauling posts and wire with an economy of motion that told her he had done the work 100 times before on land that was never his own. He rose before she did each morning, and by the time she came out to the well, he had already watered the horses and checked the corn for the particular wilt that meant the difference between a crop that could be saved and one that could not. "You favor the north rows," he observed on the third morning, watching her walk the field with her hand trailing along the stalks. "Why is that?" "They were my husband's idea," Leanne said. "He planted 'em closer together than his father taught him. Said the shade would help against a summer like this one. He was dead before we knew if he was right." Silas said nothing to that, which she appreciated more than any words of sympathy would have earned him. He simply nodded and went back to checking the irrigation channel that ran along the field's edge, and she found herself, against every instinct that told her not to, grateful for a man who understood that some grief did not want comforting, only company. By the second week, the two of them had settled into a rhythm that neither had planned, but both seemed to trust without discussing it aloud. Leanne rose before the heat became unbearable and worked the garden behind the house, where she grew what the corn could not be relied upon to provide, while Silas took the horses out along the fence line to check for the soft ground that meant a post had rotted through. In the evenings she cooked what little the summer had given them, and he ate it without complaint, and more than once she caught him watching the horizon the way a man watches something he is waiting on, though she could not have said what he expected to see. It was during that second week that she learned he had a gift with horses that went beyond ordinary handling. A gelding belonging to a neighboring rancher had bolted through her fence one afternoon, foaming and wild-eyed from a rattlesnake strike near its foreleg, and while two of the neighbor's own hands stood back afraid to approach, Silas walked toward the animal slow and low, speaking in a register barely above a murmur, until the horse's ears came forward instead of pinned flat, and it led him near enough to see the wound. "You've done this before," Leanne said, watching from the fence rail. "More times than I can count," Silas said, not looking up from his work. "A horse that's afraid doesn't need a rope. It needs someone patient enough to let it decide on its own that you're not the thing it should be running from." He glanced at her then, briefly, and something in the look made her wonder whether he was still speaking only of the horse. She did not ask. The trouble arrived on a Thursday, riding 4 men strong and led by a rancher named Walton Briggs, whose spread bordered Leanne's land on the western side, and had, since her husband's death, made 3 separate offers to buy her out, at a price that would not have covered the banknote, let alone left her anything to start over with. "Mrs. Joe," Briggs said, not dismounting, his voice pitched with the particular courtesy of a man who believed politeness cost him nothing and bought him everything, "I hear you've taken on hired help. Didn't realize the widow's finances had improved enough to afford wages." "He works for board, not wages," Leanne said, "which is none of your concern, Mr. Briggs." "Everything on this side of the creek is my concern, ma'am, given that your note comes due at summer's end, and I happen to be the only man in this territory willing to buy failing land at a fair price before the bank takes it for nothing." Briggs's smile did not move past his mouth. Might be time to think seriously on my offer before pride costs you more than it's worth." Silas stepped out from the barn then, wiping his hands on a rag, and something in his stance, loose but ready, made two of Briggs's men shift their weight in their saddles. "The lady said it's none of your concern," Silas said. "Seems to me you heard her plain enough." Briggs's gaze moved over Silas with the particular assessment of a man cataloging a threat. "And who exactly are you to speak for her?" "Nobody speaks for her," Silas said. "I'm just the one standing close enough to notice you've ridden 4 men onto a widow's property to make an offer she's already refused twice. Seems like a lot of company for a friendly conversation." For a moment the air between the two men held the particular tension of a fuse burning toward something neither side had decided to detonate yet, and Leanne felt her own hand drift, unconsciously, toward the rifle propped against the porch rail. But Briggs, whatever else he was, had not survived to build the largest spread in the territory by starting fights he was not certain to win in front of witnesses. And after a long moment he touched his hat brim in a gesture that mocked the courtesy it imitated. "You've got until the note comes due, Mrs. Joe," he said. "After that, this conversation changes considerably." He turned his horse and rode off with his men trailing behind him, and Leanne did not lower her guard until the dust of their departure had settled entirely back into the road. "You should not have spoken for me," she said to Silas once the riders were gone. "Now he thinks there's more between us than a man mending a fence." "Maybe there's nothing wrong with him thinking that," Silas said, and something in the way he said it, quiet, without the easy humor he usually carried, made her look at him more closely than she had allowed herself to before. But she did not answer that. She turned and went back into the house, because there were things a widow with a note coming due could not afford to consider, and the way a hired man's voice had gone careful when he spoke of what Briggs might think was, she told herself, one of them. That night, unable to sleep in the heat, Leanne sat on the porch steps with a cup of tea gone cold in her hands, and she was still there when Silas came out of the barn, unable apparently to sleep either. "You have not asked me why I have no family helping me," she said, when he settled onto the step below her without asking permission. "Everyone in town wonders. No one asks." "Figured you'd tell me if you wanted me to know," Silas said. "My husband's family did not approve of the marriage," she said. "He was not Chinese, and his father made clear I would never be welcome at their table. When he died, they did not come to the funeral, and they did not offer to help with the note that his own father had co-signed before the wedding, out of some sense of obligation that did not survive his death." She turned the cold cup in her hands. "I have not told anyone in town the size of the debt. I do not intend to. A widow who cannot manage her own land finds herself managed by someone else soon enough, and I have had enough of being managed." Silas was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice had lost its usual easy cadence. "I left my last position because the rancher I worked for skimmed wages off every man on the crew and dared any of us to prove it. I could have proved it. I had the ledger pages to do it. But he had the law in that county in his pocket, and I watched a man who tried to stand up to him lose everything he owned over a debt that never should have existed in the first place. I have been writing since, taking work where I find it, because I decided I would rather be poor and honest than comfortable and complicit." He looked at her, and in the moonlight his face had none of its usual guardedness. "That is why I did not write on the first day you turned me away, because I saw the same look on your face that I saw on that man's right before he lost everything. I was not going to watch it happen twice." Something in Leanne's chest, guarded for a year against exactly this kind of honesty, loosened without her permission. That is not the same as what happened to me." "Might not be the same," Silas said, "but it rhymes close enough that I could not ride past it." She did not answer, but she did not send him back to the barn either, and they sat together on the porch steps until the heat of the night finally broke into something almost bearable, saying nothing more, needing, for the first time in a year, nothing more than the company itself. The corn came in 2 weeks later, thinner than a normal harvest, but enough, Silas calculated over 3 evenings, with a stub of pencil and the back of a feed receipt, to cover perhaps 2/3 of what the note required. It was Silas who suggested the idea that changed everything, sitting at her kitchen table with the numbers spread between them. "There's a mill 3 towns over that pays premium for corn processed into meal rather than sold raw," he said. "If we haul it there ourselves instead of selling to the grain broker in town, we cut out the middleman's cut entirely. Might close most of the gap." "That is a 4-day trip," Leanne said. "I cannot leave the ranch unattended for 4 days, and I cannot afford a wagon large enough to haul the full harvest in one trip." "Then we make 2 trips," Silas said. "I drive the first while you hold the ranch. You drive the second while I hold it. We lose a little time, but we lose it evenly, and neither of us leaves the place undefended the whole while." "And if the wagon breaks an axle on the road, or the weather turns, or something goes wrong that neither of us can plan for," Leanne said, "what then?" "Then we deal with it same as we've dealt with everything else since I rode up here asking for work," Silas said. "One problem at a time, plainly, without pretending it's bigger than it is. I've hauled freight through worse than a river road in late summer, Mrs. Joe. The wagon will hold." It was, Leanne thought, watching him lay out the plan with the same patient economy he brought to mending fences, the first practical solution anyone had offered her since her husband died that did not involve someone else taking ownership of her problem in exchange for solving it. "You would trust me with your half of the trip." "I'd trust you with considerably more than that," Silas said, and did not look away when he said it, and something passed between them across the kitchen table that neither of them named aloud, though both of them understood it had been building since the first afternoon he had refused to ride away. The first trip went as planned. Silas gone 4 days with half the harvest, while Leanne held the ranch alone, and she found herself, in his absence, listening for hoofbeats on the road, the way she had once listened for them with a rifle in hand. Except now the listening carried no fear in it at all, only a hollow kind of waiting she did not examine too closely. He returned on the 5th day with the mill's payment in a leather pouch, and a look on his face that told her something had gone wrong before he said a word. "Briggs' men were watching the road out of town," Silas said, swinging down from the wagon. "Followed me 2 miles before I lost 'em in the brush along the river. I do not think this was chance. I think he knows about the mill arrangement, and I think he means to make sure it fails." "How would he know?" "Someone in town is talking," Silas said. "Might be the grain broker, sore about losing your business. Might be someone else entirely. Either way, your second trip is not going to be as quiet as the first one was." Leanne felt the old fear rise in her chest, familiar and unwelcome, but underneath it now sat something new, a steadiness that had not been there a year ago, built slowly across weeks of watching a stranger keep his word without being asked to twice. "Then I will need a plan for the second trip that does not depend on quiet." They spent the evening working it out, and what they arrived at was simple enough in its bones. Leanne would leave for the mill 2 days earlier than Briggs' men would expect, using the cover of a supply run to town as pretense, while Silas remained behind to make it appear to anyone watching the ranch from a distance that both of them were still on the property. It was a plan that depended entirely on Leanne's nerve holding through 4 days alone on the road, and when she said as much aloud, Silas did not offer to go in her place. "You do not need me driving that wagon," he said. "You need me here, making Briggs believe nothing has changed, so that whoever is watching keeps watching the wrong place. You have driven harder roads than this one already, Leanne. I have watched you do it." It was the first time he had used her given name without the formality of Mrs. Joe attached to it, and she felt the sound of it settle into her chest in a way that had nothing to do with the danger ahead, and everything to do with the way he said it. Careful, deliberate, like a man handling something he understood to be fragile and valuable in equal measure. She left before dawn 2 days later, and the road to the mill passed without incident until the third day, when she came around a bend in the river trail and found 2 of Briggs' men waiting with their horses blocking the narrow crossing. "Mrs. Joe," the larger of the 2 said, not bothering with courtesy this time, "Mr. Briggs would like a word about where you're headed with that wagon." "Mr. Briggs has no claim on where I drive my own harvest," Leanne said, and her voice did not shake, though her hands on the reins had gone white-knuckled. "He's got a claim on this crossing," the man said. "Land's his on both sides of the river here. You want to pass, you'll be paying a toll, or you'll be turning that wagon around." It was a lie, and Leanne knew it was a lie, because she had walked the property lines with her husband years before, and the crossing belonged to no one, held in common by an old territorial survey that predated every deed in the county. But she was one woman against 2 armed men on a narrow trail with no witness for miles, and knowing a lie was a lie did not make it safe to say so. She thought, in that moment, of every time in the past year she had been told, gently or otherwise, that a widow's place was to accept what men decided for her. She thought of Silas holding the ranch alone, trusting her to finish what they had started together, and she reached, not for the rifle beneath the wagon seat, which would have gotten her killed before she cleared the leather, but for the deed papers in her satchel, which she had brought precisely because she had suspected this crossing might become contested. "This crossing is recorded common ground under the territorial survey of 1861, she said, pulling the papers free and holding them where the men could see the surveyor's seal without approaching close enough to be a threat. "You may ride to the county recorder's office and confirm it yourselves, or you may explain to a judge why Mr. Briggs's men blocked a legal right-of-way with the intention of extorting toll from a widow hauling grain to a legitimate mill contract. Either way, I am driving this wagon across, and you may decide now whether that happens with witnesses to your interference or without them." The 2 men exchanged a look that told her the bluff, if it had ever been more than a bluff, had run out of road. The larger one spat into the dust and pulled his horse aside, and Leanne drove the wagon across the crossing with her spine straight and her hands steady, not once looking back to see whether they followed. The mill owner, a broad, unhurried man named Otis Reardon, who had corresponded with Silas by letter to arrange the contract, met her wagon himself when she arrived, and something in his manner, courteous without condescension, told her the arrangement had been built on more than a fair price for grain. "Your man rode ahead," Reardon said, helping her down from the wagon seat. "Said if a woman drove the second load instead of him, I was to treat her business the same as I'd treat his, dollar for dollar, no argument. Struck me as an odd thing to specify, until I asked around town and heard what you'd been managing alone this year." He weighed her corn without comment on the lateness of her arrival, without remark on the dust and the exhaustion plain on her face, and paid her the same rate to the penny that he had paid Silas 2 weeks before. She stayed the night in a boarding house near the mill, too tired to start the ride home immediately, and lay awake longer than she meant to, thinking not of Briggs or the note or the crossing where she had stood her ground, but of a man who had thought, before she ever left the ranch, to ride ahead and make certain no one shorted her for the crime of being a woman alone at a business counter. It was a small thing. She was beginning to understand that the small things, stacked one atop another, were the truest measure of a man's character, far more honest than any single grand gesture could have been. She reached home 2 days later, the wagon lighter and her purse heavier, and the payment she carried home, combined with Silas's from the first trip, covered the note in full with $11 to spare. The relief of the paid note did not settle over Leanne the way she had imagined it would in the months of worry that preceded it. She had expected, once the debt was cleared, to feel the particular lightness of a burden finally set down. But instead she found herself standing in the kitchen the evening she returned from the mill, staring at the small stack of coin on the table, feeling mostly the exhaustion of a fear she had carried so long that its absence felt strange rather than freeing. Silas found her there, and did not offer the easy congratulations she half expected. Instead, he pulled out the chair across from her and sat, quiet, until she was ready to speak. "I do not know how to feel now that it is done," she admitted. "I have spent a year certain that everything would be taken from me. I do not know what to do with a year that does not end that way." "You let yourself rest," Silas said. "Same as a field needs a seasoned fallow after a hard harvest. You are not required to keep bracing for a blow that isn't coming, Leanne, just because you've spent so long expecting one." She looked at him across the table, at the calloused hands that had mended her fence and calmed a wounded horse and driven half a harvest to market without complaint, and something in her chest that had been clenched tight since her husband's funeral finally, carefully, began to loosen. "You have been a great deal more than a hired hand, Silas Bennett." "I've been trying to be," he said, "though I confess I was never entirely sure you'd noticed." "I noticed," she said, "from the first week, when you split wood I had not asked you to split, and I decided it was easier to let you keep doing kind things than to keep pretending I did not want you to." Briggs came to the ranch one final time 3 weeks after the note was paid, and this time he did not bring 4 men, only himself, and something in his posture when Leanne met him on the porch told her the visit was not a threat, but a surrender of a different kind. "I misjudged you, Mrs. Joe," he said. "Thought a widow alone would fold quicker than most. I've been in this territory long enough to know when a fight is not worth finishing, and I believe this one has run its course." "Then we understand each other," Leanne said, and did not offer him a seat on the porch, and he did not ask for one, and after a moment he touched his hat and rode away for the last time. There remained, even after Briggs's final visit, the ordinary work of a ranch that did not pause for either triumph or relief. The stock needed moving to the upper pasture before the autumn grass came in thin. The root cellar needed filling against the winter that would arrive, as it always did in that territory, with little warning and less mercy. Leanne found, in the weeks that followed the note's payment, that she and Silas fell into the labor of preparing for the cold season with the same wordless coordination they had built hauling corn to the mill, each of them anticipating what the other would need before it was asked for. It was during the second cutting of hay that Silas finally told her the rest of what had driven him from his last position, the part he had not shared on the porch that first restless night. The rancher he had worked for, he explained, had not only skimmed wages, but had, when a young hand named Foster tried to organize the crew against it, ridden to the county sheriff and accused Foster of theft, a charge that stuck for no better reason than the rancher's word carrying more weight in that county than any hired man's could. "I helped him gather the evidence," Silas said, mending a hinge on the tool shed while he spoke, not looking at her, the way a man speaks more easily about hard things when his hands are occupied. "I should have testified when it came to trial. I told myself I could do more good staying quiet and getting the ledger pages to a lawyer who might use them later. Foster served 4 months on a charge that never should have stood. By the time I found a lawyer willing to listen, he'd already served his time and left the territory entirely. I have not been able to find him since to tell him I was sorry for standing where I stood instead of where I should have. "That is why you spoke up so quickly against Briggs," Leanne said, "even before you knew me well enough to owe me anything." I decided a long while back that the next time I saw a man like Briggs treating someone the way that rancher treated Foster, I would not measure the cost of speaking before I spoke, Silas said. Some debts you cannot pay to the person you owed them to. You pay them forward instead, to whoever needs it next. Summer eased toward autumn in the weeks that followed, the drought finally breaking in a string of storms that greened the pasture and filled the creek back to its banks. And Silas Bennett did not leave when the harvest was fully in, though the terms of his original arrangement had long since been satisfied twice over. He stayed and mended things that did not need mending, and found reasons to walk the fence line at the same hour Leanne walked it, until neither of them pretended any longer that the reasons were about fences at all. It was Leanne who spoke first, on an evening in early autumn when the light came long and gold across the corn stubble. "You told me once you'd rather be poor and honest than comfortable and complicit," she said. "I've been thinking that a ranch with a husband on it is neither poorer nor less honest than a ranch without one, provided the husband is the right sort of man." Silas turned to look at her, and whatever composure he usually carried into difficult moments seemed, for once, to entirely desert him. "Are you asking me something, Leanne, or telling me something?" "I am asking," she said, "though I already know what I hope you will say." "Then yes," Silas said, before she had finished the sentence properly. "Yes, to whatever question that was, and to every version of it you might have asked instead." They were married 3 weeks later in the small church in town, Leanne in a dress the color of the corn at harvest, and Silas in a coat borrowed from the mill owner who had become, over the months of their arrangement, something like a friend. There were no grand guests, no wealth on display, only the handful of townsfolk who had watched a widow hold her land through a hard summer, and a cowboy who had chosen to stay when leaving would have cost him nothing. Standing at the altar, Leanne thought of the day Silas had ridden up on his dark brown horse asking for a ranch job, and of her own answer, that she had asked God for a husband before ever considering a hired hand. She had not expected, that first afternoon, that the answer to one prayer might arrive disguised as the answer to a problem she had not yet learned to ask help for. But, watching Silas Bennett say his vows with the same quiet steadiness he brought to every fence post and every wagon load and every crossing where the two of them had stood their ground together, she understood that some prayers were answered slowly, in the shape of ordinary work done honestly, long before either person recognized what they were building. And that brings us to the end of this one. If you stayed with me all the way through, thank you. Stories like this one only get told because folks like you sit down and listen. If you liked what you heard, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you want more stories from the old frontier, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Until then, take care of yourself, and thanks again for being here.